Singapore says it will not impose retaliatory tariffs on the US, despite this being allowed under a bilateral free trade agreement. Reacting to the far-reaching tariffs imposed by Washington, Singapore Deputy Prime Minister Gan Yong says tit-for-tat tariffs may escalate into a global trade war. He warns that the country is entering into choppy waters and that the government may have to adjust the growth outlook for the year. Nasyrah Rohim with this report.
For over 20 years, goods from the US have come into Singapore tariff-free under the current bilateral free trade agreement. US even has a $30 billion trade surplus with Singapore, but the country wasn't immune to US blanket 10% tariffs.
We are, of course, naturally disappointed. Under the FTA, we have recourse. We are able to take countermeasures and also seek dispute resolution. However, we have decided not to do so because imposing retaliatory import duties will just add cost to our imports from the US, and this will affect our consumers and our businesses. What we are going to do is that we will reach out and engage the US counterparts and to better understand their concerns and to see how we can work together constructively to address some of these concerns so that we can have a long-standing, long-lasting partnership in trade and investments.
This is just the start. Mr. Gan warned that households and businesses have to brace for rising costs and uncertainty, adding that Singapore is looking to address its economic growth outlook for the year.
We can see that some countries are already announcing retaliatory tariffs, and if this tit-for-tat tariff measures continue, it may escalate into a situation where you may end up with a global trade war. And this will have a significant impact on the global economy because it will affect trade flows, you will create choke points for supply chains, and you will also undermine the confidence of consumers and businesses, and investments may also slow down. So I think all this eventually may lead to a significant slowdown in the global economy, and this will also in turn affect Singapore's economic outlook in the medium to long term.
DPM Gan pledged to keep the economy open, adding that Singapore will keep working with multilateral trading partners to strengthen economic and trade ties with different regions. For instance, deepening the integration within ASEAN by tapping on new growth areas like the digital economy. And if things take a turn for the worse, more support will be given.
It's still early days because we will need to assess what is the impact on the businesses. Then we can target our measures to help them. Say, for example, they may be able to look for alternative markets, look for new markets where they can export their products to, which may not be subject to these tariffs, and we may need to help them to explore and to open up access to these new markets.
On top of government engagement, the private sector will work with their counterparts. This will be to address specific concerns and see if there's room for adjustment for the tariffs.
A senior minister, Lee Hsien Loong, says Singaporeans and businesses should be mentally prepared for rough times ahead. In a Facebook post, Mr. Lee says Singapore's growth will be hurt, even though it's too early to say by how much. He also says that while this year's budget provides adequate support, Prime Minister Lawrence Wong and his team will monitor developments closely and are ready to help households and businesses if necessary. Well, the Monetary Authority of Singapore says it stands ready to curb excessive volatility in the Singapore dollar. It also adds that it will continue to ensure that Singapore's foreign exchange and money markets continue to function in an orderly manner. Now, this is in response to US President Donald Trump's announcement of those 10% tariffs on the city-state. MAS says Singapore's foreign exchange and money markets continue to function normally. It is also closely monitoring developments and assessing implications for Singapore's economy. Still, economists warn that higher tariffs on Singapore's trading partners like Vietnam and Cambodia could slow economic growth in these markets, and that would in turn result in less demand for Singapore's exports in the region and fewer tourists coming in.
Apart from the direct impact from tariff on Singapore, there could also be indirect spillover effects. Consumers may not buy so much of Singapore-made products, as well as perhaps spend so much on Singapore services. So that could also cause the economic slowdown in Singapore to be greater than the direct impacts.
And following the announcement, Singapore's benchmark Straits Times index fell 1.1% when trading opened. It recovered most of its losses and closed 0.3% lower at around 3,940 points. The Singapore dollar also getting a bump higher against the US dollar, which lost ground against many global currencies today. Let's get more on what this would mean for Singapore's economy. I'm joined by Shiana Yu, economist at Oxford Economics. Now, Shiana, Trade and Industry Minister, we heard there, spoke about the possibility of recalibrating economic forecasts earlier today. What's your take of how Singapore's GDP could look moving forward?
Yes, thank you for having me. So yes, in terms of the economic growth picture for this year, we are revising down our forecast given the increased tariffs, not just in Singapore, but amongst all other economies globally, will cause will have an impact on Singapore's exports, which forms a big part of Singapore's economy. For that reason, we are revising down our forecast. Right now, we think it will be 0.2 percentage points lower than what we had initially of 2.8%. So now we are forecasting growth this year to be 2.6%, and it will be substantially slower next year, just slightly under 1% of growth next year.
All right, got it. Now, before we get to the next question, I want to take a quick look first at how Trump's tariffs are expected to increase the prices of goods around the world. Our fears are growing over the tit-for-tat measures that affected countries may take, and these could lead to global trade wars, hitting Singapore in the medium to long term. Now, a trade war could happen when countries start imposing trade barriers on each other, and that's when one country imposes tariffs and the other country responds by doing the same. These retaliatory moves would make countries' exports more and more expensive, slowing down global trade and harming economies. For countries that depend heavily on exports, like Singapore, businesses would see a drop in demand for their goods abroad. Households could also find themselves bearing the brunt of higher prices, and as the global economy weakens, Singapore's economic growth would also take a hit. Shiana, so are we likely to see that R-word recession this year? If so, what's your take on how bad it might be?
Well, okay, thank you for that question. At least in Singapore, we are not expecting a recession for several reasons. The first really is because even though Singapore has also been the target of US tariffs, it is firstly one of the lowest, it's been hit just with the baseline 10%. It's the lowest in Asia at least. So there are some areas where Singapore could stand to benefit. And then secondly, also is because generally, Singapore has got its main is a re-exporting hub, it's a main re-exporting hub in the region, and that's how it's going to benefit from less trade going through, for example, Vietnam previously. They might be rerouted to Singapore, and that's how it might benefit. For that reason, we don't think there'll be too much of a hit to Singapore this year. But given that, as you mentioned earlier about how increased tariffs lead to higher prices, generally we think the pie will be smaller. The demand for goods in general will be smaller, and for that reason, we think that there will be a downgrade, will be a slowdown, but probably not as severe as to reach a point of recession.
Yeah, good to know. Because Minister Gan was also mentioning that if needed, the government will step in with measures to alleviate the situation if required. What do you think they might need to prepare, or what do you think might be needed?
Yes, so I suppose the key thing here to think about is that tariffs primarily target goods rather than services. So whatever kind of packages that the government might have in mind to try and support the economy will probably need to be targeted primarily towards those areas, those sectors so manufacturing, for example. At the moment, the US has also put some exemptions on certain goods. In Singapore's case, the most significant would be on pharmaceuticals. They make up a third of all Singaporean exports to the US. So until there is a little bit more clarity on what's going to happen there, we think the support should go towards other areas of manufacturing or other areas where Singapore's companies, SMEs, for example, have greater exposure to the US market. So we think that's where the target should go to first.
Yeah, Shiana, countries like Malaysia are saying that the best response to these tariffs is a strong economy. And as you mentioned earlier, there could be opportunities. So talk to us a bit about the silver linings that you see.
Yes. So one of which I've already mentioned, which is that Singapore might benefit from increased trade rerouting. Another area where Singapore might benefit from could be in some of these areas where Singapore has a comparative advantage in production, where the US just simply does not, and it's probably the reason why they're holding off on those tariffs, for example, in semiconductors, in pharmaceuticals, and these are areas also which the US has a strong import reliance. So for now, these are some of the sectors that they'll probably continue to do slightly better compared to the rest of the economy. For us, we are also seeing that with Singapore having one of the lowest effective tariff rates, even after these announcements, Singapore will probably be able to absorb some of the share of imports going into the US, not just in the near term, but probably over the next, over the rest of this decade. So these are just some areas that we think, Singapore, some opportunities for Singapore moving forward.
All right, thanks so much for that balanced picture, Shiana Yu. Talking to us there, she is an economist at Oxford Economics. Thank you very much.